So I think I'll open the floor to discussion. So if there are questions or comments, Jeremy.
Well, I actually have a question for Dan. It's interesting, the elimination of Locke from the story here kind of reverses the tendency in the historiography that I was talking about this morning from the bicentennial period when it was Rousseau who was being eliminated, and there was a seeming solid consensus that it's really Locke's version of natural rights that we're dealing with in 1789. And I also fear that you're tending to eliminate one of your mentor's key discourses here. The discourse of reason seems to be disappearing from the discussion. And this brings me, among other things, to the figure of Condorcet, who seems to me in many ways maybe he doesn't use the name of Locke, and of course he will not appear in the Archive Parlementaire because he doesn't get elected as a deputy, but I'm sure we both agree he's very central to this discussion. And it seems to me he also has a very Lockean and very rationalistic notion of the origin of human rights that's hard to describe in sentimentalist terms. So I wonder if we aren't getting too excessively one-dimensional picture here of what's really going on in those critical months leading up to the drafting of that decision.
Well, I mean, the reason there's no rational discourse is precisely because I'm arguing that that's the shift away from a rational understanding of rights. And it's true, I mean, someone like Sayes will also have a much more rationalistic. And so in the longer version of the paper, what I do suggest is that that other tradition never goes away. And that even someone like Vattel, Biron-Maki, Bamirac, when they do continue to get read throughout the 18th century, and there even are some, like Vattel, that's 1758, people are still writing in that other vein, but actually the article starts off with an opposition between Candide and the droit des gens by Vattel, because in Candide, Voltaire is always attacking the droit des gens and the droit public, and I think it was written the year after, and he had read Vattel. So I think that this tension actually goes through up and is still there during the debates around the Declaration. But that what's new is the emergence of this alternative, which I'm calling the more enlightened. I mean, I'm not trying to say that Condorcet wasn't enlightened, but it's just a way of labeling these two discourses.
Well, as your last comment suggests, there'd be a lot to argue about that. If we're going to eliminate Condorcet from the definition of enlightened, where are we going?
Well, but I'm just saying that what's new about this period, the enlightened contribution to this district. And on Condorcet, I mean, I wouldn't concede entirely because, I mean, I didn't get a chance to talk much about the physiocrats, but I think they're much more on this enlightened side. As many people have pointed out, there too you have this like looks like, smells like Locke, kind of sounds like Locke, but isn't really Locke. I mean, they're actually their ideas, as Vardy even has written, the ideas of property are not really Lockean. So I think this is always our tendency. You know, we see Locke where he doesn't always appear.
David. Question for Darren. So it's a lovely project. It's a question and a comment. I mean, the question is very simple. It's how do you, to come back to what Kent was saying, how do you avoid rewriting Becker? And I guess the suggestion is, you know, what seems interesting, one of the things, and many things that seem so interesting in what you're saying, is the way you have voices that come out sort of against light. So the passage you quoted from Burke, I mean, I think that's from the passage, lovely passage about, you know, the age of chivalry is gone. It starts with Marie Antoinette glittering like the morning star. And then what is the conquering empire of light and reason doing? It's dissolving the pleasing illusions which made power liberal, which made power gentle and obedience liberal, and so on and so forth. And this new sort of appreciation of things that shade you from too harsh a light. And then if you go up, 20, 30 years in time, you start finding a whole artistic movement that has a great appreciation of darkness in a new way that maybe wasn't possible in an age of stronger churches and stronger belief, different kinds of belief. So maybe you can make this as much about the play of light and dark as about simply light, replacing looks and veritas and there's sort of new meanings being taken for this.
Thank you. You know, it's funny, I hadn't even made, when I was putting these columns together, the Becker connection. But yeah, I mean, clearly it's something one will have to deal with. So that's, I'll take that very much to heart. I don't know what I have to add. As I say, I mean, it really is such an early effort in all this. And I think that what does interest me the most is not just the opposition to light, because we do find this a lot, right? Just sort of labeling your enemies as dark and you embracing light. And no Christian in the 18th century conceded that the Enlighteners were light and we were living in darkness, of course. But it's the articulation of that language then into kind of material culture that actually really interests me here. And so this, you know, these episodes like Lantern Smashing and so forth. But I take your point, and I think that, you know, this whole kind of Gothic interest in darkness and then in neo-Gothic architecture in the 19th century is tied up with this in interesting ways. And so sort of making those connections will be, I think, the fun of this.
And it's partly because all this new technology allows people to be out at night.
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
Yes.
I wanted to mention a block, and that is in Madame de Genlis's Adèle et Théodore, 1782. When at the end of the book, there's a reading list for children, and in her reading list for children for Adèle et Théodore is Locke.
But what law?
I think it's a second treatise. I'm not sure.
Because
I'm not sure. I'm not
Public
exactly sure.
education of children. which was
No,
what-
I think it may be on government. I mean, take a look at it. I'm doing this from memory. Secondly, in her writing against Rousseau, she was always saying that he stole everything from Locke. So that's also one of her, and so she'll rewrite, I mean, she republishes a version of Émile in about 1813. So she is very much an Anglophile. She's born in about 1750, and don't forget that she also will educate Louis Philippe. So that's also, so there's kind of an important, interesting connection there with, as she's kind of fighting against this sensibilité and kind of working against that. And again, like I say, one of her strawmen tends to be Rousseau, and she says Rousseau stole everything important from Locke.
Well, so let's just be clear.
So
I'm not
just
trying to
anyway.
say that there's no Locke in the French Enlightenment.
No, I'm just
because
giving
Locke,
you a
of course,
sense.
is everywhere with
Mhm.
the essay and with the
Yeah.
education of children.
Yeah.
And if she's talking about Émile, then I bet that the Locke that she's
Yeah.
referring to is the letter on education,
Yeah.
which a lot of people pointed out the similarities between Émile and that.
Right.
So this is
Mhm.
it's not a claim about Locke, it's a claim about the second treatise.
Yeah, but like I say, I can't remember exactly, but I'm almost thinking that on government is, I mean, she has just the list, you just need to pick up Adèle et Théodore and take a look. Yeah.
Could I interject a couple of things about Condorcet?
Actually, no. I'd rather you didn't.
Well, actually, it bears on the rather stark distinction we're making between the Locke of the epistemology and the Locke of the politics. And thinking about this, the beginning of Condorcet's starts with sensations, right? Human individuals are capable of having sensations. They therefore are capable of having pleasure and pain. They therefore have rights to pleasure and pain. The point being that one of the things that seems to happen is an ability to derive rights notions from the sensationist epistemology. And exactly how that works, I've never figured that out. It just happens because it happens, because people say that because we are sensate beings, we have rights. And so, in a sense, to say, well, there's the epistemological Locke over here and the political Locke back there, may not actually fit the case, because the epistemology is in fact politicized, becomes the basis for the claims to our rights as sensate beings. And that, I think, also picks up or speaks to Jeremy's point, which is Condorcet, and Emma's written about this very persuasively. Condorcet believes very much in sentiment. He spends a lot of time talking about the sentiment of justice. When he talks about education, more particularly the education of his child, it's very much in terms of we must inculcate the sentiment of justice, the sentiment of rights. So again, I think I think we're maybe drawing too stark a dichotomy between the various locks, and B, it's not clear that Condorcet would be one lock rather than the other.
Yeah.
And thirdly, there's Condillac. And so much of this discussion filters through the Condillac sensationalism that, again, we have to be careful whether we're talking about Locke or not.
So I mean, I agreed entirely with what you just said, and I was even trying to suggest that Locke and the essay are precisely what provide the foundation for this new epistemology. It's just that they're not also referencing the Locke of the second treatise to make the point. Because as you just, I mean, that's what you just described is not at all a Lockean theory of the origins of rights.
No,
right?
not at all.
And so they're using the Lockean epistemology, but they're not adopting Locke's political arguments to get at rights.
Yeah, I have a question about that too, and it's the epistemological shift that you talk about. It seems to me there are really two epistemological shifts, and you're not distinguishing. I mean, your 17th century guys are reasoning from a rationalist tradition. Then you move to the Lockean, Condillacian, sensationalist tradition, which can be the basis of a very rational theory. I mean, because it's sensational, it's not necessarily sentimental.
Right.
And I think you need to pay attention to the relationship between sensationalism and sentimentality in that shift.
Yeah. Yeah, sorry.
I was just going to, and I would be curious what other thing. No, not at all. But when I was taught Locke in graduate school by Frank Turner, and I remember him always saying, you know, the essay, of course, is read at great length, but no one reads the second treatise on the comment at all. And in fact, I had that built into my undergraduate lectures. And I'd forgotten that Peter Laslett actually had sort of tried to trace that at greater length. But so I'm just wondering, how do people come to that assumption? That because I mean, even in England in the second half of the 18th century, the second treatise is dangerous business. You know, and human people kind of sweep it under the rug, right?
So how do contemporary historians?
Well, I'm just wondering how
who's saying
you're combating the view that you're combating the view that they're getting the rights talk from Locke's second treatise, but I've taken it as a sort of given that people weren't reading that text in particular.
Well, I mean, so it continuously gets asserted in the scholarships, like in Marc Bélissa's book, the Christmas de l'Argent, he makes the claim that basically they're all Lockean. Florence Gautier was mentioned earlier. Basically describes the Declaration as a Lockean text.
But it's referring to the second treatise?
Well, when those claims are made, it's always with respect to the second treatise. Yeah.
So they're French writers who claim that?
Mostly, but I could give you other examples.
I mean, I don't care. I just, was curious. I care.
I'll send you that.
Sorry.
Yes.
I mean, the emphasis has been on the epistemological shift from the older natural rights law discourse to the 18th century, and I'm sure you're right. But it's what struck me as something that seems sort of an afterthought or ancillary, and yet I'm wondering whether it's maybe more important than you've framed it, and that is the sort of stylistic or the literary, or the fact that the ways in which the latter ways of expressing the new, supposedly epistemologically, is more stylistically coded and framed as to approach, I mean, it's not philosophical. It's,
right.
And I'm wondering whether, I mean, I might to claim that that's more important would be to say the tail is wagging the dog in a way, but it could be more important than you're assuming.
I agree completely, and actually my first name for this was the belletristic tradition. But I think it's intrinsically related, that they're criticizing the philosophe for being too erudite, too pedantic, they're citing all the time. They do want this different genre of rights, and you know, Voltaire writes a poem on natural law. Rousseau's writing essays, Diderot's writing dialogue, and I think this all does lead up to the great Enlightenment genre that gets created, which is the Declaration. And David Armitage actually has treated the Declaration as a literary genre, and I think it's one of the genres that is produced precisely through this shift.
If I can make a suggestion on those lines, I was going to push you on this topic. If you talk of rights taught with the conversational chit-chat, I believe you've fallen on the side of parole. And where there are parole, there's law. There's structure behind it or something, so that when people can just fluently talk rights taught, that means there's a language behind it which is tacit, totalized, or you can't see it, and that would be a way of thinking about the philosophical complications, which, as we've all said here, are extremely various.
And I think one could also look, I mean, given the fascinating emphasis on the legal aspect of rights law, one could also look for the use of the word right in different kinds of legal sources, and that in a way, and you mentioned the point about the other ways of looking at texts and social networks. I mean, Dan and I were poring over one of the computers in their digital history.
Well, it would be a beautiful.
One could sort of connect the ordinary life use of the word right through a series of legal documents to.
And it must be there.
Well, you know, Mike Saunders actually writes about this.
Gentlemen, look at the time, please.
Yeah.
Can I say something important now?
Yes.
Finally!
As opposed to
something sad, which is, you mentioned this time, I mean, people know that he passed away a week ago yesterday, a week ago today. This background died tragically. Sorry, I should have waited for the end. I'm sorry, but yeah, I just thought it would, I couldn't let it go past too long.
I didn't know that.
I didn't know that either. Framed it in quite the same way.
But Kent, you were going to say?
I forgot.
Oh, yes.
No, I was just going to point out that, well, this is connected, it's Mike Sonninger, one of
Right,
his
that's
collaborators.
yeah.
In Working Wages talks about natural right in the legal sphere. And I wasn't really able to connect those two, but I should have done more. Maybe it's not too late. So.
Brian Tierney addresses that in the origins
Right.
of human rights and the economistic tradition, and the use of the word right in a subjective sense.
Yeah, and I have a bit on that, which it's interesting that it's actually not really very present in France. I mean, this is something else that is only quite late in the build-up to the Declaration that people start speaking of the plural. And most of my guys, it's just the droit naturel, which has, I think, very important ramifications, but I don't want to pick up any more airtime.
There was a question. Yes, please.
To go back to Darren's project, I was thinking about the problem of finding a place to look at the contestation between light and dark in a technological sense. And I was wondering if you thought of looking at the contrast between, say, public and private and domestic architecture, which you mentioned, the introduction of light.
Yeah.
But the private light, there might be some sense of that still being something that is or should be in the darkness, or a privacy,
Yeah.
or a shadow.
And even the use of that metaphor to describe being in the dark, right? I mean,
But, yeah.
I mean, in other words, the things you do privately, right, in your own bedroom.
Sexuality
Yeah, absolutely.
and things like that. I know that you're thinking in terms of kind of a concretization.
Yes.
So I was thinking about the relationship between space and those notions of dark and light.
Thank you. I think it's a wonderful. Am I right in thinking that Greg Brown is working on interior spaces and whatnot? Does anyone know? Maybe not. Because that's what I'd love to do is to look at, the sort of theories of architecture and space to see if I can get at some of that. And why, are you opening up windows in the 18th century and letting light flow in, or for health reasons, and But it's a very striking thing, right, to walk into an 18th century building, at least, granite buildings, and it's a very different experience of light than you would have had in the 17th century. And so people who are theorizing that, please.
On this note, you may want to look at actually the opposite, at the transformation of the Pantheon, where windows were closed. So at the moment when the church needs to be transformed in character and as a symbol, 80 Concile blocks, they're still visible. Actually, you can see that the church was well lit. It was one of the brightest spaces of the 18th century, and it's turned into it has to be turned into a tomb. So it has to be made darker.
So it's actually during the revolution that we
Yeah,
had block.
yeah,
That's interesting.
However, Rousseau is down there, or is Voltaire in the basement
Oh,
holding
no.
a flame
The technology of glass, I would think, to be
Yeah.
a bit
Yeah.
speak up for the material.
Maybe.
Actually, Daniel Jute, he's a good friend of mine, he's here in Cambridge, he's working on windows and doors in early modern history. I don't know in which countries exactly, but might be worth getting in contact with him. Also, I wanted to ask you if you know when in France we first had street lights. We showed some pictures of street lights, and because it might be interesting to look into the field of police. In London, for example, we had first street lights after the Great Fire of 1666. And I think it could be a field where Christian language and Enlightenment language come together, and in the Reformation of manners in England it was the case. I don't know if there's something interesting in France as well. But actually, the societies of Reformation of manners used the metaphor of light to, also to go into the bordels and catch people who had sex illegally, or perhaps it might be interesting.
Yeah, definitely. No, it's 17th century, and there's a big push under Louis XIV in the early part of the 18th century, and then it extends. And it's very much resisted, in part because people are made to pay for it as well. And I believe that there are laws requiring that people illuminate their windows on certain feast days and holidays and whatnot, which of course is expensive. And so there's a kind of dubious thing. But by the end of the 18th century, there's really extensive lighting in Paris. And then, fairly quickly after that, there's that one with gas lamps.
Also to prevent prostitution, for example.
And crime, street crime. So, so it's a mixed feeling. And on the one hand, you want it because it makes things a little safer. On the other hand, it prevents you from doing naughty things.
I just, on light, I wanted to mention that at the University of Brest, there's a guy, Thierry Anna, who's working on lighting in Mediterranean port cities. And particularly on these issues of how lighting in ports can help to avoid sort of criminal activity and things.
Thierry Anna?
Yeah, I can, if you just type in his name,
Okay.
I can help you.
Thank you. It's exactly what I was hoping for. These kind of comments I very much appreciate.
And in terms of design, one of the things that came to mind that could be interesting is sort of study of public buildings and even in Revolution ministerial buildings, and some of Ralph Kingston's new work on the sort of floor plans and changing designs in changing ministerial regimes, whether things are closed or more open depending on the minister, and how likely that might be interesting in terms of the relationship between politics and how people want the spaces of the ministry to be perceived by the public who might attempt to come like that.
Just building up on this, I've been thinking also about what you said about the windows and the light that's penetrating, and I can't help thinking in the Habermasian sense of the boundaries between the public sphere and the private sphere that were blurred during this period. And also, continuing your point regarding the clothes, I'm an art historian, and I've been working on sculpture, on portrait sculpture that show exposure of the bodies. And I've conceptually connected these physical exposures to ideas of self-exposure, to, for example, Rousseau's Confessions. If you think that on a conceptual level you can somehow connect or tie these ideas of self-exposure to the light as something that exposes, maybe you can continue this thought.
Well, that's the piece of it. Sure.
Yeah, that's good.
I wonder if I could ask Emma Rothschild a question, which is, could you say more about the conception of enlightenment that brings these people that you were discussing into the enlightenment?
So glad you asked that. Well, certainly being educated was, I think, one of the primary contemporary senses of Lumière, and of course it's quite right to say that the Enlightenment was a later phrase, but Lumière was used quite often, and often as a rather banal synonym for being educated. So I think I was very interested in how education penetrated through social networks. I think to some extent I was following the idea of what the Enlightenment is as a milieu, as a sect, and as a disposition, the three main meanings, and sort of experimenting with different kinds, so printing and writing. And I think one thing that did come out quite strongly as I worked on this is how important the expulsion of the Jesuits was in the mid-century. And if you look at something as dull as the history of colleges across France, I mean, this was an immense transformation at the local level. So I think I'm adopting really the traditional 1790s counter-revolutionary view of Enlightenment as some big change that happened in the middle decades of the 18th century that was associated with the sect of philosophes and economies, and broadly with the milieu of printing and writing, and that had profound political consequences. And this is what Tocqueville, a generation and a half later, was trying to make sense of. So it's that.
Would it be fair to say, Emma, that language doesn't distinguish then between a high enlightenment and a low enlightenment? I mean, that this is Susan's enlightenment as a process that emanates from where it emanates, but sweeps up all in the process.
Well, I think they're very different meanings of enlightenment, and one also has its origins in the sort of the lovers of obscurity, the haters of Locke, sort of starting in about 1791. This is related to John's work, honestly, that there was a kind of conspiracy theory about a sect of enlightenment, but an association between what the sect was doing and a much more amorphous change in mentalities and dispositions. And I think there are lots of, one interesting thing to look at is the relationship of all this to the kind of long distance influences in France, whether or not one calls it globalization. But I do think, in relation to what Dan was saying about the other Locke, it seems clear to me that both Locke and Rousseau were primarily theorists of education, if one looks at the sort of dissemination of those two writers. And that's why, the reason Fenelon was such a massively, so they are going to deconstruct that too, but was because of what he was saying about education. And as Bernard Bailyn wrote years ago about the United States, the history of education has been put in a sort of separate category for historians of education policy, and it's actually fascinating from the point of view of so many people. Yeah.
One last question. Paul Kreiser.
a perhaps naive question, but I'm curious as to where, at what point and through what mechanisms this philosophical discourse found political salience. I mean, we've been talking, the discussion has been at a very elevated level, and there seems to be, I'm thinking about my training in the 1960s as the first PhD student at Keith Baker, when social history of ideas was in vogue with Peter Gay and so on. I was struck by the fact that this discourse and the entire discussion has been at a level that doesn't really bring it down to the point where, whether it's through the Parlement or the Pej and all the other things that Keith has written about and others in this room have written about. So this may not be the point at which to have a discussion of this subject, but I just was struck by that fact.
Yes. I mean, I think potentially one of the big pluses of trying to do a prosopography of this period is that you can find people whose own lives continued into the revolution, and you can find thousands of people in Angoulême who were alive in 1764 who actually did things in the revolution. So I think I see my part of the project, and they clearly see their projects, as another way of trying to get at the Keith Baker question.
Other reactions to Bob's question? What does this have to do with politics?
I mean, it seems like in my case it's kind of intrinsically connected to politics, right? Since this becomes the very first language of the French Revolution. It's true that it's not that central to the 18th century debate. Madly is always making fun of the parlementaire for not knowing anything about natural right. Though it creeps in various places.
Well, you said it well. I am sort of interested in more abstract things, I have to say, although I think that inevitably when you follow, things like attempts to illuminate cities, to eliminate crime, and attempt to smash those lanterns that have been put up, these are fundamentally political questions, and so the politics will come out in the practice.
On which note, I thank you all.